Edwin, I don't see you, but at least you are enjoying the freezing weather.
That's right. I had to go and put my fur coat on. No, I think there's something wrong with my video.
Oh, no, you're on. No, you're not. Well, your name is there. I can hear you, but we can't see you.
Yeah, there seems to be something wrong with my video.
Acabaste, ¿no? Con Bilahari Kausikan y los embajadores de...
Good morning, Chris. How are you?
Yes, who's that? I don't see you.
Chris Weaver from Moscow.
Ah, Chris. I'm sorry, I don't see you on the screen.
No, that's okay. There's plenty of people on the line. I'm going to knock off now and be quiet. I just wanted to say hello before you start. That's all. So looking forward to reading the book.
Gilles, how are you, Gilles? I see you, Gilles. Leo, thank you. Igor.
Hey, Ashok Mirapuri is on the line, but he's off camera, off mic.
Hello, Bilahari. Hoshi speaking.
Oh, quite a lot of people. Oh.
Ariel.
Ambassador Igor Kalabensky.
Igor Havalensky is on the line? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Igor, how are you?
Bilahari.
Turn on your camera. I haven't seen you for 200 years.
Bilahari. Yuri Sigov is also on the line. Remember Yuri Sigov?
Yeah, of course. Where? Is he on the line?
I see Yuri. Hello, Yuri. Long time no see. Years and years. Oh, Lian Chu, how so many people.
Really long, yeah.
Okay, really? Let's start.
Shikata-san is on the line.
Medical center with diarrhea. As part of protocols, he took a PCR.
Let me just drop off and I'll try rejoining. I think that then that may.
Okay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the WSPC RSIS virtual book launch of Post-Soviet Russia, Life and Work. I am Henrik Singh from RSIS, and I have the pleasure to be your MC today. Before we start the event, let me share some housekeeping notes for all audience members joining us on Zoom. Firstly, please keep your camera and microphone turned off for the duration of the event. Secondly, please post your questions via the chat. And lastly, please note that this webinar is recorded and it may be shared publicly online. Today, we'll be launching the book titled Post-Soviet Russia, Life and Work by Mr. Chris Chiang, a senior fellow at RSIS. This book revolves around the professional and personal experience of a diplomat from Singapore, living and working in Moscow, beginning in the aftermath of the USSR's collapse and ending in the first decade and a half of this century. The panelists you will hear from today will be discussing this book and hopefully elicit further discourse and thought from our audience and the book's readers. I would now like to invite Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, to deliver his remarks. Ambassador Ong, please.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Everything good to all our friends and supporters out there. Thank you for joining us for this book launch. We are very pleased to see so many of you, and I'm sure Christopher Chiang and Bilahari Kausikan are pleased with catching up with many of their old friends in Russia. and other parts of the world. We are officially launching the book Life and Work in Post-Soviet Russia, written by RSIS Senior Fellow Christopher Chiang, or we call him Chris. This event serves two goals. First, we want to introduce the book to you, the audience, and to the general public who may wish to pick up a copy of the book. Hitherto, the majority of the books, commentaries, and analytical articles on Russia in the English language has been dominated by academic experts, journalists, and others from what we call the Anglo-Saxon world. Chris' view of Russia, in which he lived and worked for almost 15 years over 3 separate diplomatic postings in Russia between 1994 and 2013, provide the reader with a Singaporean perspective of Russia from the throes it found itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in late 1991, to its return to stability and to the international stage in the first decade of the 21st century. So this is something quite extraordinary for me personally, and for us here in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Study, RSIS, at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. It's the first time we have someone from among our researching group here able to produce such a book and on such an important country. Russia's role and influence in the Asia Pacific cannot be underestimated, now or in the future. For sure, it faces serious domestic and foreign policy challenges. However, the fortitude, resilience, and collective strength of the Russian people will ensure that Russia remains a great power. Russia has weathered many heavy storms in the past, and there is no reason to doubt that it will overcome the severe impact of the coronavirus pandemic, the fall in energy prices, and the serious geopolitical instability in the face of turbulence in US-China relations. In this regard, the second objective of this event is for participants to benefit from the assessments of the panel that we have assembled today. The panelists from Russia will give an assessment of Russia's relations with the Asia Pacific and how the Russian economy is expected to progress in the harsh environment we are facing today and in the coming year. We in Singapore and ASEAN is the regional grouping in Southeast Asia, consisting of 10 Southeast Asian countries, will definitely benefit to learn more about Russia and its development from the views of the panelists and their discussion following their respective presentation. We will also be having the question and answer session. I hope all the speakers will keep to time so that we can have good questions and answer with the audience so that we can learn even more. I hope there will be lots of good but short questions from the participants. Before I finish my remarks, let me thank Professor Alexei Puskov, Ambassador Tatarinov, and Ambassador Pranjit, Professor Lukin, Mr. Gavilenkov, and my good friend Pilahari Kausikan for the time and contribution they have given to bring Russia closer to all of us today. I also thank you, all the participants out there, for making time to join this book launch and making it a most memorable event. I think Chris Chiang is now a very proud man. This book is going to be making him more famous, and I have to start taking numbers to see him very soon. Thank you very much for your attention. May I now proceed with the rest of the event? Hendrik, you want to take over? Maybe I'll let you do it since you're there. Okay.
Okay. We now invite, thank you, Ambassador. We now invite Professor Alexei Pushkov, Senator of the Russian Federation and Chairman of the Commission on Information and Media on the Federation Council of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation, to deliver his remarks. Professor Pushkov, please.
Hello, everybody. Do you hear me there?
Yes.
Good. I would like to welcome this distinguished group of professionals, some of whom I have met in my lifetime, either in Moscow or in Singapore, that I visited about 10 years ago, and still keep the best impressions from my visit, which was on the invitation of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, public school, and I particularly would like to express my good feelings about the reason why we gathered today. The reason is a very impressive book by my old-time friend Chris Chiang, which could be titled, as far as I can judge, The Discovery of Russia, because Chris starts his book citing his first contacts about Russia and his first contacts in Russia, his first impressions. It's almost a Marco Polo experience, but Marco Polo was discovering China. Chris has discovered Russia, and he was so much impressed that he spent how many? Well, quite a few pages to describe what his experience was and what his conclusions are about Russia. I would like to support Chris' writing, because there are not so many books on Russia that have been written recently outside of the Western, so-called Western world. I mean, Germany, France, Great Britain, United States, and unfortunately, what we see in the studies by European and American experts, it's very much tainted by political approach and by some very deeply ingrained bias that has been always, since the times of the Cold War, impregnating the approach of Western experts to Russia. One of the examples that I can give is that the Yeltsin period of about 10 years, from 91 to 2000, is usually described in Anglo-Saxon political literature as a period of democracy, which would lead the reader to come to the conclusion that it was the best time for Russia. In Russia, it is considered to be the worst time in the second half of the 20th century, because the social price for Yeltsin so-called reforms was enormous, and we have fallen to For instance, the male longevity of life was 56 years in 1995, just to give you one figure. So an objective analysis of what has been going on in Russia for the last 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union is badly needed. And I can only express my joy at the fact that Chris has written an honest, multidimensional book where he presents different points of view. I can see his own point of view through his writing, which is very good. It's not just in the book is personal, and taking into account Chris' 15 years experience in Russia, it's good that it has this personal dimension. I'm a little bit less optimistic than Chris in assessing Russia's relationship with the Western alliance in the coming years. I'm afraid that with the election or with the coming rather of Joseph Biden to the White House, which is highly probable in the United States, and with the trends that do now exist between Russia and Europe, we are in for a long period of a new Cold War, I would call it. And the reasons are very, very multiple. The fact that Russia is a European country culturally and historically, the fact that Russia is a European power does not, unfortunately, negate the fact that we have very, very much diverging interests and approaches with our Western counterparts. And in the last 10 years, they have become much more profound than before. I think that Russia's relations with the West will depend not only on the interaction between Russia's interests and Western interests. It will also depend on the domestic developments in the West and in Russia. And those developments are very dramatic, because whatever Joseph Biden says, America is very fragile. The United States have a lot of domestic problems, and they have layers and layers of domestic problems. And I don't think they will disappear with Biden coming to power. And even if Trump is not more president, Trumpism will be present in the United States. And the Afro-American minority will claim for their rights. And the social fabric of the American nation is very fragile. Look also at what happens in France, where they have about 7 million Muslims and big problems, internal problems, domestic problems, cultural problems. So I think that analyzing the relationship between Russia and the West and Russia and Asia, we should see not only foreign policy, we should watch attentively and closely what is going on inside the West, what is going on inside the main Asian actors, and what is going on inside Russia too. So I would say that the domestic policy dimension is becoming critical to foreign policy, much more critical than it used to be, say, 20, 30 years ago. That would be my most general observation. I would like to stop here. I would like to thank Chris for publishing such an important book, which I hope will enjoy the attention of the audience, not only in Singapore, but outside of Singapore. I think it's absolutely worth it. I would, on my part, recommend it to my Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Pakistani colleagues. I have today, in 1 hour, I have a meeting of the ambassador of Pakistan in Moscow. I would also like to say that I have published a book in France, which is called The Geopolitical Chessboard, the Russian Game, which is my response, in a way, to Chris's book. It appeared slightly before. I would, if it is now it is being translated in Italian. If it is translated in English, I will gladly send you a few copies because I think that it's my book has a very close interaction with Chris's book, because it is about the evolution of Russian foreign policy interests and about the evolution of Russia's understanding of international politics from Gorbachev to Putin. So I think that those two books could make a very good couple. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and one more time to wish Chris's book a long and happy life in international universities and among international experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pushkov. May I now invite Ambassador Andrei Tatarinov, the Ambassador of Russia to Singapore, to deliver his remarks. Ambassador Tatarinov, please.
Okay, yes. So, hello to everyone. I'm glad to see many familiar faces, and it is a pleasure to me to attend this book launch today. I have read the book with pleasure, and I want to express my deep appreciation of Chris's initiative. You know, I was reading the book not only as ambassador to Singapore, but as a career diplomat whose life has been connected with the Asia Pacific for several decades. And of course, I know Chris personally. He may remember me too as Deputy Director, then Director General for Southeast Asia. Of course, the book is a very valuable addition, given that Chris is unique in having served in Russia for 13 years. I think this record will not be beaten in the near future by any of Singaporean diplomats. Actually, the book is kind of 3-in-1. The discovery of Russia, as Professor Pushkov put it, the bilateral relations between Russia and Singapore, and actually Russian foreign policy vis-a-vis the West and China. The personal observations of Chris are very valuable. The 90s was a very challenging time for Russia, and I want to thank Chris for giving a very objective view based on his meetings and conversations with Russian people from different walks of life. He gives the view of the man in the street. He often refers to the man in the street opinion. So I think it is very interesting, and it reminded me of many events of this challenging period in the Russian history. The second part, I think, is very interesting, given that Russia-Singapore relations have been developing rapidly in the 21st century. Chris failed to mention one but important meeting, the first in-person meeting between then President Putin and Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong in December 2005 in Kuala Lumpur on the sidelines of the first East Asia Summit. The meeting was short. I attended it, maybe half an hour, but it was kind of a catalyst. And it was after this meeting that the contacts between Russians and Singaporeans intensified substantially. And another important meeting, it was mentioned, it was in 2008 when both the Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew and Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong were in Moscow. The meeting was between the two and Mr. Sergei Naryshkin, then Chief of Staff of the President. Actually, the Joint Intergovernmental Commission was conceived at this meeting when Minister Mentor finger pointed at Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong and said that this man will be in charge of Russian-Singapore relations in Singapore. I want that he had a counterpart. And Mr. Naryshkin proposed that a joint commission be established as with many other countries. And this initiative materialized the next year in 2009. So I think that there is a demand for such books today. And if you come to a bookstore in Singapore, you will not find anything about Russia, not to say anything good about Russia. This book gives a very objective and balanced view of Russia-Singapore relations and many aspects of the Russian policy. But the last part, Russia relations with the West, is more subjective, and I think it's not incidentally that Chris quotes many foreign scholars with their view on relations between Russia and the US, Russia and the West as a whole, Russia and China. Nonetheless, it is important that different views are presented in this book. So a keen reader, an interested reader can make his own conclusions. I value the good job done by Chris, and I sincerely hope that we will have a chance to meet after this launch, and Chris will sign a copy of this book for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We now invite Ambassador S. Premjit, the Ambassador of Singapore to Russia, to deliver his remarks. Ambassador Premjit, please.
Thank you. Very good evening to all of you. I'm delighted to join all of you for Christopher Chiang's book launch by World Scientific today. I'm also happy to see my mentors, Bilari Kausikan and Ong Keng Yong, whom I've worked with for over 25 years. I would like to thank our 4 Russian friends, Professor Alexei Pushkov, Ambassador Andrei Tatarinov, Professor Alexander Lukin, and Mr. Evgeny Gavrilenkov for joining us on this panel and for their part in strengthening bilateral relations between Russia and Singapore all these years. Christopher is the go-to man on anything related to Russia in the Singapore Foreign Service. Before I was posted to Russia slightly more than a year ago, like many others, I too met Christopher to get his advice on how to navigate and learn from him. After answering the same questions from many different MFA officers, he must have decided to put it all in a book. Christopher's book is remarkable in 3 areas. First, as Professor Alexei Pushkov mentioned earlier, as well as Ambassador Tatarinov, this book provides a balanced first-hand account based on 3 tours of duty, of Christopher's 3 tours of duty in Moscow. To understand Russia today, we must understand the events that happened in Russia in the 1990s. Christopher was in Russia when these events happened. He called this period the difficult decade. Second, he pulled together a number of themes that remains relevant today. One theme is this idea of disorder in the 1990s versus order and stability that many Russians feel that they have secured today. Another theme is the economic devastation in the 1990s and the subsequent economic rebound or recovery. In 1998, for example, Russia had a negligible US $8 billion in reserves, and today it has US $600 billion in reserves. Russia is now the 11th biggest economy in the world. At the same time, Christopher lists the main economic challenges facing Russia currently, and many of us, I think, agree with those challenges that he has characterized in his book. Christopher lists another recurrent theme in the book is Russia's disillusionment with the West, which I think some of the previous panelists have spoken about. This disillusionment with the West is pertinent as it helps explain the topsy-turvy nature of Russia-West relations today. Finally, this book is timely in the sense that we are witnessing a churn in the international order. The strategic rivalry between US and China is shaping the global power competition, with Russia and the EU trying to find or secure a favorable position for themselves within it. For both Russia and the EU, the key question is whether they are able to move towards a path of managed coexistence and maximize their strategic space for maneuver, or continue the Cold War path of hostility and post-2014 downhill trajectory as depicted in Christopher's book. How the Russia-EU relations evolve will have an impact on all of us, including on Southeast Asia. I hope these remarks have kindled in you an interest in the web of themes, questions, and choices in Christopher's book. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chris Chiang, author of the book and senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, will now deliver his remarks. Mr. Chiang, please.
Thank you, all of you. I'm actually, normally I'm not such an emotional person, but today I'm quite emotional. I'm not used to being praised all the time. But anyway, to be serious, first of all, let me thank all of you for coming, for helping me, for helping us organize these events. And I have to say special thanks to my boss, Mr. Ong, Bilahari Kausikan, Mr. Tan Chin Tiong, who, like Mr. Bilahari, was the top civil servant in Singapore Foreign Ministry. He, as well as a late colleague of mine, V.G. Menon, she unfortunately died early this year, helped make my book better. I also like to thank all those people who have endorsed my book. There are at least 10 or 12 people. I guess age is catching up on me. I can't remember, but I think it's about 12, sorry. I would like to mention all of them, unfortunately, because of time constraints. I can't, but their names and their generous comments are found in my book. One of them is here, Mr. Yevgeny Gavrilenkov. Yevgeny, you are listening. Thank you very much for your generous comments. Now, having never written a book on Russia or any country or anything before, I must also say it was quite a daunting experience. But in this sense, I must thank Mr. Ong for having given me a lot of time to work on this book. Let me just say the following about Russia, and I'll try to make it as fast as I can. Russia is a country which I, or anybody who has lived there for the better part of a decade and a half, cannot forget. In fact, even if I try to forget, I can't. It is a country, I think, quite misunderstood by foreigners, including Singaporeans, by the way. I think most Singaporeans read about Russia, of course, the sources, mainly foreign press, of course. And those who may be Chinese educated, they maybe read Chinese sources, but it's still, Singaporeans really don't know much about Russia. I think a lot of people don't. I cannot say that I have become an infallible expert on the country, of course, but my long years there and meeting many people, including some of them here today, like Professor Pushkov, Mr. Gavrilenkov, and of course, Professor Lukin. Many people I met there, Russians, foreigners, Singaporeans, and one of them, I think, is here, Edwin Tam, who has also been there more than 20 years. And another foreigner, if I may mention fast, Chris Weaver. He's also one, I think, of the foremost authorities on the economy in Russia. He's also been there a long time. All these people, including the people I've met in my embassy, my fellow colleagues, they all gave me the knowledge to write about this book. Now, when I was there, of course, I didn't think I was going to write a book. So I didn't keep any diary. I didn't keep any journal. But the fact is that when I started working this book 3 years ago, I sat down and I said, what the hell happened there? What happened to me? What happened to my wife? What happened to my daughter? What happened to the country? And it just came back. And it shows to me the indelible impression that the country left on me, my wife, who, by the way, speaks Russian too and loves and admires the country like I do. The indelible impression that the country left on me. I hope my book will provide the readers, my readers, with a Singaporean perspective, as people have already said, Singaporean perspective. Throw some light upon the country, which, again, I repeat, not many people know much about. But in conclusion, I want to just say this, if I may repeat myself. My knowledge of the country, the knowledge I gained, would not have been possible had I not met everybody whom I met there. People, some of them I can't even remember their names because unfortunately I lost contact with them. But again, those who are now present, like, again, if I may mention Professor Pushkov, Evgeny Gavrilenkov, and Professor Lukin. They, among others, and I don't know whether some of the other people I met, including the foreigners there, and Singaporeans, I devoted a chapter, an entire chapter to that, to their views. Some of them I can think on the screen here, if I may use this opportunity to thank them, like Edwin Tam, Chris Reefer, Alex Brooking. Now, without these people, I would not have been able to write my book. So actually, I like to say I'm an expert on Russia, but I'm really not. It is because of other people, their knowledge, which they imparted to me, that I have become a so-called expert. Finally, let me make two final points. I would like to stress that I'm not an apologist for the country. Some people may think because my book has not many criticisms of Russia, that I'm an apologist. I'm not one. I am neither an apologist nor an unrelenting and unforgiving and blind critic. I'm certainly not that. I have criticized, where I think criticism deserves to be mentioned, but I do not want to criticize for the sake of criticizing. However, I must add that no person can ever divest himself or herself of his or her own ingrained prejudices about a country, about a person. And in that sense, my observations, I try to be objective, but I cannot say that they are totally value-free. My book is also devoid of what I call analytical parameters. I try to write it as a person, without having a theory about this, that because Russia was under the Tsars for so long, therefore democracy, I try to write it in the way I saw it as a person. And that's why you don't see many footnotes. There is no bibliography. And so whatever conclusions I've come in my book, if they happen to coincide with the views of other experts, that's merely coincidental. In conclusion, I would like to say no foreigner can actually claim to have or to be a font of all knowledge of the country. I think only Russians can claim, Russian experts, of course, on themselves, only they can make such a claim. So in that sense, I'm happy here today to hear what Professor Pushkov has said, and I also look forward now to Professor Lukin and Mr. Gavrilenkov to add to our knowledge of the country. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chiang. May I now invite Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, former ambassador of Singapore to Russia, to give his remarks. Mr. Kausikan, please.
Well, I will be very brief because you are not here to listen to me, but I want to add my congratulations to those of others to Chris Chiang. He was my deputy chief of mission in Russia during that difficult decade, and I think he has done an extremely valuable job of explaining Russia from an angle most Singaporeans do not see. We have two distinguished panelists. You have your bios. The bios are available online. I won't waste time introducing them. I want to ask them a simple question to start off this panel discussion. As a number of previous speakers have said, most Singaporeans are not well informed about Russia, and what they think they know about Russia usually comes from Western sources, which are not always the best balanced source to learn about contemporary Russia. So I would like to ask our two distinguished panelists, starting with Evgeny and then Alexander, what is the one thing, in your opinion, Singaporeans ought to know about your country to give ourselves a balanced view of Russia? Evgeny, please, can you start?
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think, do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for this introductory remarks and for the question. And I really want to congratulate Chris with a very interesting book. And just let me go ahead with an answer to this question. I don't think that one thing will be sufficient to talk about Russia. It's a big country, big economy, very diversified. And if I were to be concise, I would say that Russia is resilient to shocks, more resilient than it used to be. Then I would add that its reluctance, reluctance to grow. We've seen that in the past 10 to 12 years, economic growth was very sluggish. But at the same time, I would also add that the economy is gradually evolving. So it's at least three things. And if I have time, I may clarify it a bit. What does it mean? First of all, resilience to shocks. We remember 92, 93, a very long period of deep recession in Russia. Then it was followed by a bounce back later on. In 2008-9, there was a difficult period as well. It was much deeper contraction in 2009. And in recent years, the difficult year for Russia was 2015, when the oil price fell and sanctions were imposed on the country. But expectations at that time were very gloomy. So many people expected the Russian economy to contract deeply for 5–6% and recession lasting longer. In fact, it was only 1 year of recession, -2%. So this year, expectations were also very gloomy in the second quarter when the pandemic hit the country and the lockdown was imposed in many cities. And people also expected 6–7% contraction GDP. Most likely we'll have around 3.4–3.3% contraction. So it's resilience is illustrated by the numbers. And when you want to know about Russia, I would advise not to read the headline news. Look at the numbers. The numbers are more flashing and they reveal more. So what's next? I think what's important. Oil price, I think this is also the most commonly quoted factor affecting Russia, but just recall 2013 when the oil price was very high, close to $110 per barrel, no sanctions, but economic growth was sluggish. It was only 1.8%. In 2017, the oil price was half of that, $55 per barrel, but economic growth was also 1.8%. So what we have seen in recent years, it's really dependence on the oil price of the Russian economy is easing, not only growth-wise, but also if you look at the structure of the budget revenues, it's gradually a smaller portion of federal budget revenues originates in the oil and gas sector. So it means that some structural change is occurring, but once again, most important that the economy in the, I would say, more or less normal circumstances is still was unable to demonstrate faster growth, around 1.5–1.3% on average in the past years. So what's the problem? I would say probably one of the issues is that the dominance of the big companies who are more capital intensive and who are less adaptable to the changing circumstances. The share of small businesses, which used to be rather small in the past years, around 22% 3 years ago, the latest available number for 2018 suggests that the share of small business in the economy, small and medium-sized business, was around 20%. And I'm afraid that this year it's even smaller. So the most adaptable and the most, I would say, motivated part of the business is very small. That's why their contribution to overall economic growth is very, it's minimal. So again, I don't want to spend too much time. I was limited by around 5 minutes. I tried to advise to look at the details, what happens in the country, what is happening outside. But I believe that especially given that in the years to come, maybe even for a decade, we'll see more difficult relations between Russia and the West and Europe in particular. Europe was always most important trade partner for Russia. I'm less optimistic than Chris in the outlook for the next years regarding Russia and the Western relations, Europe in particular. Russia, with the dominance of big companies, became an easy target for sanctions. So as we have seen, Russia was able to somehow adjust to this new regime. But it's one of the factors which doesn't allow the economy to grow fast, but at the same time, it stimulates structural change. So I think that if regulations will be more investor friendly for local small businesses, the economy will be able to grow faster and it will be even more multicolored, the economy. So thank you. I think I'll stop here. If there will be questions, I'll be happy to answer. And once again, thank you, Chris, for the interesting book.
Thank you, Yevgeny. Over to you, Alexander. Hello, Alexander, can you hear me? Professor Lukin?
Oh, sorry, you switched off my mic. So just to make it clear, do you need just one thing, or I
no,
have
you
to?
can take your time. I mean, I asked for one thing, but you can give us several things.
Okay. Then the first thing and the most important for ordinary people, I would mention the difference in geography. And let me give you just some figures. I counted here that the territory of Russia is 23,286.6 times larger than that of Singapore. And the population is only 26 times larger than that of Singapore. So Singaporeans should understand that it's a huge country, and in most places, very few people live or nobody lives there. It's just forest. So, and now temperature. Well, we know temperature in Singapore, in Russia in the summer, it's in most places is like 20 to 30 plus centigrade, which is a little less than in Singapore, but in winter in some places, it can be up to minus 70 centigrade, which is of course not at all like Singapore. The average is about 20 and minus 20, minus 30 is normal. So we are very different. And there is a theory, by the way, coming from ancient Greeks, people like Hippocrates and Aristotle, and later in Europe by Montesquieu, that the character of the people is formed by climate. And they also wrote, the Greeks did, that in the northern climate and cold climate, people tend to be good warriors, but they tend to be not very good in trade and not very good in organizing the society. So who knows, maybe they were right. So, and another thing more serious, well, this is also very serious, of course, is that people in Singapore, I would say, should understand that Russia only about 30 years ago, even less, yes, about 30 years ago, freed itself from a very brutal totalitarian regime, which actually eliminated the entire classes of the population, of the people who were able to think in a kind of independent way. The educated classes, and they were either physically killed or had to leave the country. And very few countries, probably no country in the world experienced that, had this experience. If we compare it to Germany, in Germany there was a brutal regime of Nazis, but it was a very short time. We had like several generations of that. So we are now a free country, but the way of thinking is still influenced by that time. And we probably need several generations to come out of that, so to raise new people who would be prepared to think in a more independent and more kind of creative way. So Russia has its problems, it's settling them and it's solving them, but it needs time, I think. So, and that's why I like Chris's book and other books of Singaporean authors, and many diplomats wrote these books, like Ambassador Kausikan. I read everything basically that he writes and quotes it often. His thoughts. I read before writings by Ambassador Mark Hung also about Singapore. He wrote a very good book, because we need this kind of outside perspective on Russia and on other societies. And I especially like the Singaporean or generally Southeast Asian intellectual tradition, because it's a very interesting societies that you have in that part of the world. They are not as one-sided as Western tradition, but it's not completely Asian, because Singapore, for example, of course, has absorbed a lot of different cultures, including Western, European, Indian, Muslim, and whatever. So I like very much, and I think it's very important for Russia to be seen and described from kind of outside tradition, and this helps us to understand ourselves better. For example, because people usually tend to take everything that they have good for granted, but what is bad, they criticize this sharply. I like that Chris's book, his first impressions of Moscow, which describes in the beginning his first impressions of Moscow. He says Moscow has very wide streets and avenues, and I thought, well, I didn't even think of that. I thought it was normal, but you know, if Singaporeans think that it's good, it may be really good, because it's important, because it means that the Soviet government were building wide streets, but there were few cars, but they were kind of looking in the future. Now we had a lot of cars, and these large, broad streets really help us. So you see, small things like that help us very much to understand good things we have and also bad things we have. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. We still have about 7 minutes to go. Are there any questions from the audience? Henrik, have you received any questions in the chat room? I don't see any questions from the audience, so let me ask both of you a simple question. I think, how do Russians look at Singapore, if you look at Singapore at all? I think Professor Lukin is quite correct to emphasize the difference of size. I used to tell some Russian friends that you can take Singapore and drop us in Siberia and we will never be found again, right? Because it's such a vast country. But how does a vast country like Russia look at a tiny city-state like Singapore? Can you share your impressions? First with you, Alexander, and then Evgeny. Yeah, Alexander first.
Okay, they're keeping switching off my microphone, but well, Russia has a tradition of thinking about Singapore. I remember even in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a famous song by a Russian author, Mr. Vertinsky, who later immigrated and came back, who sang about banana and lemon kind of Singapore. But this was, of course, kind of a mystical country, which almost like of a fairy tale. This was not, of course, of a people knew very little about real Singapore. It was like a faraway place, you know, where people like to travel, but not real. But I think that now, of course, few people know Singapore very well, but I would say there are several things that at least experts or even a broader circle of people would know about Singapore. First of all, that it's a small but very effective country, and many people know the founder of it, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and how he created effective economy and at the same time fought corruption. Fighting corruption is an important question in Russia, and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew experienced, especially when he wrote in his book that the first thing he did was to put his friend to jail. This idea is very popular in Russia, I would say. Then I would think about Singaporean diversity. As they say in India, it's a society based on the principle of unity in diversity, that it has many ethnicities, many different, 4 official languages, many ethnicities, many religions and traditions, but at the same time, it's one country, and it certainly has a kind of, I would say, national values and national policy, which is also very interesting, because Russia is also a very diverse country, and it's important for us to be not just a country of one ethnicity, but somehow to create a system of cooperation between various religions, various ethnicities, and various regions. Thanks.
Thank you. Evgeny, do you have anything to add to that?
Maybe just very little. Alexander already mentioned a lot. I would probably also add that when the Russian people think about Singapore, it's about education, especially in recent decades, which became very known and very advanced according to all the rankings, universities, schools. Normally, universities are very highly ranked in Singapore, and this is very much appreciated by Russia. And when also Russians think about Singapore, I would say it's not so many similarities, as was already mentioned, size of the economy and diversity of the economy, the structure of the economy. But it's very impressive that even though the country is geographically small, it was able to grow without any natural resources. And that's what actually probably remains a kind of, not a mystery, but is very much appreciated by the Russian Singaporean watchers or people who are interested in the Asian countries. But it's always very interesting to compare the regulatory environment in Singapore and in Russia, and what can be improved in the Russia. So it's, as I said, it's mostly positive. I never heard anything negative and thoughts about Singapore.
Thank you. I have a few questions from the audience, which I will take, although it will bring us a little bit over time, if that's all right with the organizers. The first question is from Ariel Tan, who describes herself as a fan of Russian literature, the classic literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gogol, and so on. And the question to the panel is whether you think these classics of Russian literature are still relevant to understand Russian society and Russian character. Either of you can answer this. Any of the panelists can answer this. The question is, are the classic Russian authors like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on still relevant to understanding Russian society and Russian character?
Well, I can try.
Well, please.
Well, if we're talking about the great Russian literature of the 19th century, it is relative in a way. Of course, Russia is a different country. So if you want to find same streets or same buildings, you can do it, but not always. But of course, to understand what Russianness is, for example, you can sometimes read about like Russian understanding of nature, Russian understanding of religion. These things, I think, because it's a different society, but because Russians also raise on these books, they read them, and their understanding of the world is close. Maybe also kind of they have inherited their tradition mostly from literature. So I think it's that there are two aspects. Yes, it's not these books. The society they describe is of course very different, but the way of thinking is in a way a bit similar.
Thank you. Evgeny, do you want to add anything to that?
Again, very little. I think it's relevant to read classics not only for Russia, but also any other country, because it's cultural traditions and classics, whether it's literature or music, it shapes the societies. I think it shapes the society in general. And what is relevant, I think, most important. Many Russians, they like to look inside themselves, to think about their inner life. And that's what Russian literature, the classical literature is about, especially Dostoevsky. I think it's very important to read it maybe not only once, but reread such classical books.
Thank you. I have time maybe for one question, and then I'll give the panelists a little time just for final thoughts. The question is from Ms. Lily Ong, and I guess it's for you, Alexander, because you are a China specialist. The question is, by reverting to a highly centralized system of power and control, is China repeating the mistake made by the Soviet Union? No, sorry, is China repeating the mistake made by the Soviet Union? Where will this take them, and how does Russia view this trajectory? The Chinese trajectory, I mean.
Short answer would be, I don't know, because China, of course, is a very different society from that of the Soviet Union, because China accepted market economy, and its economy is very effective, while Soviet economy has never been effective. But I don't know where it leads to. We should wait and see. China may have a lot of problems in the future, because they do have a lot of problems, and but the Chinese themselves claim that they have found a new way of development. Well, who knows? It's a big country. Well, I would say, thinking about Singapore, I would say that the big problem about China is whether China is going to become a big Taiwan or a big Singapore. Taiwan meaning like completely westernized China type society, and Singapore is a bit more organized, I would say, but at the same time very effective. But we don't know the result. So let's wait and see.
I think that's a very wise answer. Nobody can see the future. Evgeny, do you want to add something?
Maybe again, very little. I fully agree that we don't know what will happen in China, but it doesn't look very similar to what happened in the Soviet Union, because China still remains a highly important manufacturing economy, and it will be so. The Soviet Union was very different in this regard. So from the economic point of view, I don't think yet China is very close to the period similar to what was seen in the 80s in the Soviet Union. Politically, it's again a very difficult issue, very difficult question. Even though I don't see such an internal pressure from China, I'm not a China specialist, but I don't see much internal pressure from the Chinese society and the strong demand for political change. And don't forget that Soviet Union was a completely closed economy and this closed society. China is very open, and it is getting more open to the foreign culture, to foreign influence. So it could be a very different path for the Chinese society and the economy to evolve, not similar to the Soviet Union, most likely.
Thank you. Okay, we have gone over time, but I will give both the panelists, starting with Evgeny and then Alexander, say 2 minutes each for any final thoughts you have.
Final thoughts. Once again, I really enjoyed reading the book, and while participating in this panel, I somehow tried to summarize what was written there, from culture towards future political relations between Russia and the West. It covers a lot. What I would also add, what I didn't mention in the past during my presentation, maybe if we come back to the Russian economy, Russia still has a huge potential, as we all know, to grow faster. And what may help the economy to grow, to deliver strong growth and strengthen in the future as well, is a fiscally conservative economic policy. What allows Russia to be fiscally conservative? It's what makes it more resilient to shocks, but at the same time, what doesn't allow the economy to grow fast. It's the dominance of cash-rich big companies. Whenever it happens outside, they have some fat, and they don't claim for much additional support from the state, as opposed to many European countries which are highly dependent, especially this year, from the funding from the government, like in France or even UK. So, but fiscal conservative, if Russia will continue to be thrifty in spending money, not throwing too much, not to repeat what the Soviet Union was doing in the past, not to go ahead with a huge mega project, but allow more diversification on the ground to allow small independent businesses to evolve, to grow, then the economic growth will be more sustainable and fast.
Thank you. Alexander, final thoughts?
Well, I like books like that of Chris. My favorite book in world literature, one of them, apart from Russian books, is Gulliver's Travel by Jonathan Swift. Because this guy invented an imaginary countries to have a perspective, an outside perspective to describe British society at the time. So Singapore is so different from Russia that Chris did not have to create an imaginary country to have such a far away and objective point of view. As I said, it's a very important and one of the most interesting perspectives in the world, because Singaporean perspectives is not exactly European or Western. Western perspective has become becoming more and more ideological and biased. And if you read American books on Russia, they would basically tell you that you must do this and you must do that, and in the end your people will become as happy as say Libyans or Iraqis. If you are really lucky, you'll have such brilliant and wise presidents like Mr. Trump or even Biden. I'm not sure if we are all in that game, and would be very happy about it, but its Singaporean perspective also is not typically Asian, because as I said, it absorbed a lot of influences, and it's intellectual, which is a rare case in this world of memes and dictums and whatever, where many people just don't think and use other people's predetermined ideas. So I would like to read more from Chris, and I would be very happy to see him in Russia again. And the role of Singapore, I think, is very important for us, because Russians always discuss when they meet together, or usually they meet 3 people together. That's a typical Russian group. So they usually discuss things like how to make Russian economy more effective, or how to make Russia a freer country, and whatnot. And I think the Singaporean experience, which is both quite free and especially effective economically, I think it would be very important for us to understand. Thanks.
Well, thank you all. I must apologize to the members of the audience who had submitted questions, but we have gone far over time. And it's very good to see some old friends. Edwin, Igor, how are you? You're looking good, Igor. All right. Well, thank you all. I'll give it back to Hendrik to wrap up this session.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Mr. Kausikan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the WSPC RSIS virtual book launch. We are pleased to announce that the book is on sale at a limited time special launch discount of 20%. Details of the discount will be shown on the screen right after this. On behalf of WSPC and RSIS, thank you for joining us today, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Alex. I see Alex, Leo, everybody.
Good to see you.